This program was originally delivered to the Smith County Historical Society on April the 3rd, 2007. Where were you at 7:55 a.m. Friday, April 26, 1957? That's 50 years ago this month. Were you in Southeast Tyler? If so, chances you will know exactly where you were and exactly what you were doing when an F2 tornado ripped across that part of the city. It's been very interesting to talk to and email with people who almost invariably say something like, "I can see it as clear as anything," or "It's just like it was yesterday." For some people, it is like remembering the Kennedy assassination or 9/11. For others, it is a time divider. Things happened before the storm or after the storm. This was not the first tornado to hit inside the Tyler city limits. On Valentine's Day, 1908, a tornado struck during the night, killing 4 people and sweeping everything clean for 5 miles, 100 feet wide. Called the most disastrous tornado in Tyler's history, at least to that point, the storm hit both St. Paul's Methodist Church and Hebron Baptist Church. Then 7 years later, another tornado hit the fairgrounds, destroying a couple of buildings, severely damaging 5 stables of the racetrack, taking the roof off the grandstand and generally tearing up trees, but injuring no one. Of course, there have been other tornadoes to hit other parts of the county, one as recently as last December 29th in the Flint-Gresham area. Our 1957 tornado was relatively small compared to others across the state earlier in the 50s. 114 people died in Waco on May 11th at 1953 when an F5 tornado hit their downtown. 13 died in San Angelo that same day. And earlier in our month, on April 2nd, 1957, 10 had died in Dallas when an F3 tornado hit there. In all, Texas saw 145 tornadoes, 38 deaths, 489 injuries, and over $60 million in damages in 1957. So it's understandable if our storm gets lost in grand meteorological history. But if it's your home or your school that gets hit, it is still traumatic and memorable to you. And that means me too. I was 3.5 years old when the 1957 tornado hit, and my house was one of the ones the Red Cross labeled as uninhabitable. I've been able to assemble an interesting collection of photographs, and I'd like to give credit before I get started. First, the Tyler Morning Telegraph has been extremely helpful. They scanned their glossy photographs and gave them to me on CD to use. Those will be the high-quality black and whites with newspaper captions. The poorer quality black and whites were scanned in from microfilm. Everett Taylor ran a column in the paper back in November, which brought me stories and more photos. The color shots are from Kelly Hobbs. The snapshots with April 1957 at the bottom came from John Birch. The ones of our house were taken by a neighbor and are from my photograph album. The accounts I will give are mostly from the newspapers, with individual stories added in. Friday morning, April 26th, was dark and rainy. At 7:55 a.m., some folks were enjoying a last cup of coffee. Some were in the shower, some were on the road heading to work, and some were dropping off kids at area schools. The twister first hit the ground in a wooded patch southwest of Copeland Road, inside what would become Loop 323. The first house hit was that of Mrs. Homer Wood, who had an entire section of her roof peeled back and laid on another section. The next house was relatively unharmed, but the 2-story garage shared by the next 2 houses to the north was blown down. W.J. Thornton grabbed his son and raced to a bedroom. He put the child under the bed, then lay down on the floor. After the storm passed, he found that a portion of someone else's roof had crashed through his ceiling. Where he had stood before, running, a 2x4 was sticking through the back door. Next door to Thornton, the Carney's home received roof and rain damage, and the final house damaged on the west side of Copeland was the McFarland home. The tornado then crossed Copeland Road to take shingles off of Russell Cantwell home. then cut across the block to Wynwood, which runs parallel to Copeland to the east and is part of the Southern Oaks subdivision. On Wynwood, major damage was done to the residences of Bill Dozier at 3423 and Sam Sellers at 3417. Bill Dozier wrote the Rose City Rambler column for the Tyler Courier-Times. His column that evening began, "Thank you, Lord." He wrote, "Suddenly the rain quickened. It began to pour like water from a broken dam. Then I heard trees snapping. The wind got stronger. There was no locomotive roar, no siren-like whistle by which to recognize the approach of a tornado. Lightning began dancing all around. It looked somewhat like the vivid St. Elmo's fire that you sometimes see aboard ship at sea. My wife started over to close a window open on the east side of the house just before the leaves began to hang themselves like flies on flypaper over the plate glass door and windows in front of me. When that happened, despite the lack of warning sounds, I suddenly realized what we had. A tornado was knocking at our door. The force hit our house like a long, wide board slapping against a soggy mud bank. It was that sudden a slap, and it was gone. The top half of a tree from next door, twisted off like you would separate turnips from the greens, lay on the roof. The Doziers lost about 50% of their roof, and their car was dented. The Sellers lost a wall of their garage, too. The twister hopped over the Coulter house on Shannon, just blowing off shingles, then hit the Cameron house at 703 Johnson, just behind them. Mrs. Cameron had just left for work and said she had trouble keeping her car on the road due to the winds. Neighbors later informed her at work that one of her outside walls had been pulled in and the opposite had been pushed out. The next building hit was Andy Woods Elementary School. The tornado struck the southwest wall, plowing through classrooms as it headed north. Most of the window panels were either completely torn out or had holes and cracks in them. Few solid window panes were left. The roof received heavy damage. Harold Lawler had parked at the north entrance of Andy Woods to let his daughter out of the car. It was a little early, so we decided to let the rain slack up a bit. Then came the sudden sound of the roaring wind as an incoming freight train, and it hit. I saw the black funnel heading right toward the school, and then the rain became so dense it was just a big white mass, rain as I have never seen before. A sudden snap indicated some part, if not all, of the school building had been torn from its foundation. The twister rammed into the southwest corner of the building, and its encounter with the strong steel supports evidently shot the tornado up in the air because it passed over my car. The debris was twirling in the air, and most of the force was just like a suction. A brick rammed through the rear window of my car, and it felt for a moment like we might be taken up in the air by the funnel. He ran into the building over bricks, glass, and other debris to find about 20 children still lying face down in the building, but none seriously injured. Teachers helped with first aid, and nobody panicked. Lawler said, within a few minutes, all the children had been taken care of. Parents had picked up most of them, and teachers began cleaning up, trying to save textbooks, chairs, and the like, which had been exposed to heavy rains. Then I saw a youngster with a cut on his face and recognized him as one of those still in the hall just before the twister hit. Winnie Yo, a fifth-grade teacher, said she had arrived at the school shortly before the storm hit. She went into the lounge and heard the storm approaching. When she opened the door, she said air pressure held her back. A large piece of timber came roaring through the building. Miss Yo heard one of the schoolboys yell, "Duck and cover!" Every child immediately fell flat on the floor, face down. The children had been drilled for such an event only 2 days ago. It may have saved some lives today because flying glass and bricks were thick in the building. Not sure if this is Andy Woods or Bell Elementary. This is the ceiling at Andy Woods being repaired, and the Andy Woods sign where they're missing some of the letters. They gathered up most of them. Pollard Methodist Church across the street had shingle damage on their brand new sanctuary. Their sign was found in the backyard of a home on the corner of Fry and Barbara, blocks away. That's where the tornado, which skipped toward the northeast, hit next. The Barbara, Wilma, Dulce area in the 1,000 to 1217 range received heavy damage. Mrs. Floy R. Wolf and Barbara Wolf, 1007 Barbara, had lost part of their roof and one of their bedrooms was destroyed. All of Mrs. Wolf's clothes, at least those she could find, were soaking wet. Her kitchen clock stopped at 5½ minutes before 8 a.m. The W.H. McKenzie house at 1008 Barbara had roof damage, and the W.L. Womack house at 1010 Barbara was partly unroofed. Mrs. A.L. Roberts at 1022 Barbara had a preschooler at home. The next thing I knew, the wind was up and the metal awning outside the bedroom window was rattling so much I thought it would tear off. I got up to close a window that I'd left a little bit up the night before. At that moment, she said, the tornado passed over and I felt a tremendous suction. I thought I was going to be sucked out of the window. Then the roof went off. Rain started pouring into the hall. She added, I remember how quickly everyone came to our aid. The finest things in individuals come out during times of disaster. 1 block north at 1001 Wilma, Mrs. O.H. Fowler had light roof and shingle damage, as did O.H. Williams at 1006 Wilma. The storm blew a 20-foot ceiling joist over their house and drove it upright about 18 inches into the ground of their backyard. The Carl Gregory home at 1013 Wilma was completely unroofed. Tom Gregory, at home and a teenager at the time, emailed me his vivid memory of the storm. The wind also began to pick up. My mom was definitely nervous as she grew up in Oklahoma and had always begged my dad to build a storm cellar. He and I always kidded Mom, since we knew, of course, a tornado would never hit Tyler, much less our home. I remember clearly my mom getting increasingly edgy and suggested that we all go into one place in the house. The next part all seemed to happen simultaneously. My dad came hurriedly into the kitchen from his office, which was attached to our home. He yelled at me to follow. As the three of us ran through the den, the big bay window literally popped out. I distinctly remember watching that happen in all of 3 seconds. I heard the other windows blow. My dad was frantic to secure my sister, who was only 4, from the master bedroom where she had crawled into my parents' bed, apparently when it started raining so hard earlier. My dad grabbed my sister Greta, yelled for us to all lie down in the hall floor, where he placed himself on top of us. I remember seeing the roof of our home twist off, more popping, and now the rains were literally blowing into the house. What seems like seconds later, the sky lightened up and my dad grabbed us all to get into my sister's bedroom adjacent to where we were in the hall. He yelled for us to stay down as he took the mattresses off of Greta's twin beds to cover us. Later, he said he just knew the walls were going to come down on us. They really had no support. As suddenly as it all happened, the lighter sky turned blue, and I think I remember that it was hot. As we slowly got up and looked around, all of the windows had indeed blown out. The brick latticework on one side of the garage was shattered. Most of the brick was on our 2 cars. Our furniture and carpet were all soaked. Any of my mom's antique glassware was shattered. Pictures from the walls had been blown down or out of sight. It was the most astounding sight I had seen in my 17 years. It was a nightmare. We slowly ventured out, only to meet our neighbors walking around with the same dazed look that I'm sure we had. I realized our wired-haired terrier, Sugar, and our kitty cat, Yellow, were not there. I went back in what remained of the house calling for them. Nothing. It was not an hour later that both came walking side by side from the west end of Wilma back home. My dad theorized that more than likely they both got sucked up through the roof and obviously landed safely somewhere not too far from our home. My mother's silver service set was partially found stuck in a few of the pine trees in our backyard, as well as in our neighbors' yards. Little scraps of our life before the storm would appear for the next month or so. Dr. Philip W. Taylor's home at 1014 Wilma had roof damage. The M.T. Compton home, 1020 Wilma, also had a section of its roof ripped off, and their glassed-in porch was blown away. Mrs. Boyd Watson's home, 1023 Wilma, was completely unroofed, and the frame was twisted. It looked as if the walls had been blown outward. She received 2 cuts on her leg from flying glass and had glass in her hair. Her son said that he thought that some of the Andy Woods debris and parts of 4 different kinds of roofs were in their backyard. Someone else's mounted deer head had blown into their home. B.F. Pracho, 1104 Wilma, had shingle, roof, and window damage, and L.C. Peterschmidt, 1112 Wilma, had roof and shingle damage. Mrs. Henry H. Harrison, 1120 Wilma, said she felt the house tremble as the wind passed over. She called to her teenage son to open the doors. As soon as the doors were opened, we felt the house settle down. They only had roof damage. Sidney Ginsburg at 1217 Wilma told the paper, the wind suddenly began to shake the house. Mother and I were trying to get all the windows down to keep out the rain. When I ran to the front door, which was open fortunately, I saw a trash can in the front yard, which belongs in the backyard. A telephone pole was bent over and a transformer box was on the ground. A roof came sailing through the air and landed partially in our front yard. A few shingles were blown from our roof, and the damage got progressively worse down the street, with the fourth house from us losing the roof altogether. Other neighborhood damages included a heavy timber speared through the windshield of a new automobile and a piece of timber driven upright into an asphalt sidewalk. Here's some of the tree damage near Fry. Here are several photographs taken in the Wilma-Barbara area, but I don't know the addresses. The only house on Dulcie, one more block to the north, that was reported in the paper was that of Charles Calhoun at 1002. It had roof damage, and part of a brick wall was blown away. Further down the street, Mrs. George Phillips heard the twister coming. It made a tearing noise, then sheets of rain fell. All of a sudden, I could see the trees bending double. One more block north, John H. Smith of 1016 Rhodes had a tree blown against his house. Other houses in the neighborhood were struck by flying debris from the unroofed houses. The tornado then took another skip up into the air and headed toward Bell Elementary School area. Ann Whitten emailed me. She lived at 1827 South Fleshel. That morning she heard a noise like a huge truck laboring to get up a hill. Sometime they would move a house down our street early in the morning. I went to the door to see what was going down our street. No vehicle, so I looked to my right where Beckham and Troop Highway merge at Magnolia Street. I saw what looked like huge pieces of cardboard in the air. After standing and watching, it seemed to be in slow motion. Then another large piece of cardboard flew in the air. I decided it was rooftops, and when it looked like it was headed for my front door, I did not stay to see that it was moving towards Bell School. I yelled for the children to get under the bed. I slid under the bed, and we huddled until it all got so quiet. I remember the stillness and the yellow color of the sky. I did not see a funnel, just rooftops exploding, and how slow it all seemed to be. The tornado touched down again on Marion, 3 blocks south of Bell. At the crest of the hill, E.W. Oliver at 1315 Marion had someone else's roof hurled into his home. The storm also caved in an Austin stone wall at the back of the house and knocked out all of the windows. Hugh Denson's home at 1400 Marion was demolished, the roof torn off and the walls caved in. The tornado continued on the ground to Sunset Drive, 1 block to the north, damaging most of the houses from Lakeview East. Bruce Moore's home at 1322 Sunset sustained roof and window damage. The house at 1323 Sunset had its garage demolished. The cone of the roof at the center of the house was ripped off, and the windows were damaged. The Bell home at 1405 Sunset had considerable damage to the roof and interior of the house. Across the street, Mrs. B.A. Menard at 1406 Sunset had her roof blown off and the walls caved in. Everything inside was in shambles. She told the newspaper, "The insurance company said they'd have to build a house around my breezeway." Next door, John Craddock at 1408 Sunset had his roof caved in. The attic fan fell down and there was considerable damage. Next to the Craddocks, H.W. Anderson at 1416 Sunset had his garage demolished. The tornado picked up his car in the garage and threw it into a backyard wall. We lived across the street from the Craddocks and the Andersons at 1417 Sunset. One view with our roof over in the Craddocks' yard, a little closer look at our house. That's our roof. My father had already gone to work at TJC, and my mother, only 28 years old, was at home with 3 little children. I was the oldest at 3.5. The only thing I remember is, after the storm passed, I was out standing in the driveway crying. Someone asked me if I was hurt, and I said no. I also seem to remember men riding up from Redbud, but since it seems freeze-framed, it might have been a photo I saw later. The Tyler paper interviewed my father 15 years later, and he told them that he saw it coming just after I got to TJC. I lay down in a hall until it passed. When the tornado had passed, having seen the direction of its approach, he was afraid it had struck his home 4 blocks away. I didn't even stop to get my car. I ran home. My wife and kids, they were just babies, were there. When I got to my neighborhood, I couldn't see the roof of my house, so you can imagine where my heart was. But he found his family safe, huddled under a quilt in the front yard. Neighbors at the bottom of the hill took us in that night, and we later rented a house until ours could get fixed. But the tornado itself wasn't the end of our adventures. The following Thursday night, my father found a Japanese hand grenade with a rusted firing pin still in it in our backyard. A yellow stripe around the middle indicated that it was still live. He called the police, who put it in a locked safe and left it in our backyard until ammunition specialists from Karnak could pick it up the next day. He told the paper, "We later learned a neighbor a block away had some World War II relics, and we think the grenade belonged to him." Hugh Denson, whose house on Marion had also been destroyed, had several bomb and shell souvenirs from his World War II Pacific days. The explosives had been removed, and his kids played with them, but we didn't take any chances. The tornado continued on another block to San Antonio Street. Here are several photos of the Bell School area. I am not sure of the exact addresses. Well, that's our back bedroom window there. That's my sister's crib. And blue sky overhead. Our backyard, that's the garden where the hand grenade was. We never found our swing set. So this is the Bell School area photos that I'm not sure what the addresses actually are. That one, another, and same house, different angle. James Alexander's home at 1326 San Antonio was demolished, with only the west room saved. Mrs. Alexander received a slight bruise from flying boards. Herbert Pfeiffer at 1400 San Antonio had roof and glass damage, but Mrs. Herbert Quick at 1405 had her roof torn off and the house and garage demolished. The house at 1411 also had roof and window damage. Carol Dean Walters, who lived one hill over on Rose Road, emailed me that she watched the tornado from an upstairs window in her house. There was total stillness and silence before it hit. I watched it take roofs off and even lift my collie dog into the air. Later, she was found on the top of a barn with only a few cuts and bruises. My family was lucky because the path of the tornado went several feet from our house, so we did not have serious damage. I'm sure that straws can go through telephone poles because I saw thin wire and sticks pushed all the way through poles. I left the house almost immediately to check on a friend of mine that lived close, and I knew was alone because her mother went to work early. I tried to drive around Bell School, but too many wires were down. My friend was unhurt, so we went to school. When you were in high school, you think you are bulletproof. One more block to the north, at 1423 East 6th, Al Manning lost the roof from his house, and there was considerable damage. Across the street was Bell Elementary School. 4 classrooms were hit hardest, including a first-grade room. Early arriving students were already in their classrooms. Tommy Hamilton, son of Mr. and Mrs. C.K. Hamilton, and 2 girl students were in the 4th-grade room when the tornado struck. Tommy saw gravel flying outside and realized a storm was in progress. He told the 2 girls to lie on the floor, face down, just as they had been instructed to do in the tornado drills. Tommy did likewise. None was injured. Judy Horsley, age 8, snuggled into a corner of her classroom and put her hands over her face when she heard a noise that sounded like 1,000 airplanes going over. She escaped without a scratch. Jeannie Gentry and Richard Lacey were in a 6th-grade room. Richard had just put his books on his desk and went over to the window to watch the rain. Through the downpour, he saw a great big whirlwind. It looked like a funnel or a great big cloud. When I realized it was a tornado, I yelled for Jeannie, who was sharpening a pencil. Both of them headed for the back of their classroom. We just stood and covered our ears. It seemed like the solidest part of the room. Richard said that glass and rain were blowing everywhere. The tornado was so loud you could hardly hear anything, and it happened so fast I didn't realize it was over. Jeannie told reporters, "I didn't have time to be scared. It was all over so fast." After the tornado, the children put on their raincoats because we thought the building might collapse, and they met one of their teachers. She told us to go to her room because it was less damaged. Rosemary Powers emailed me that she was a 5th grader at Bell in Mrs. Stiles' room, which faced 6th Street when the tornado hit. There were 4 of us in the classroom that morning. I remember we were alone in the classroom, and it started to rain really, really hard. We stood at the windows and watched all the rain. I remember the train sound and the rain and wind. We watched a tree being uprooted in a yard across the street. At that time, someone said, "We better get down." In the back of the classroom, between the restrooms, was an alcove where there was a sink and storage cabinets and filing cabinets. We ran back there and huddled down together. It was all over pretty fast. When it was over, some teachers rushed in to see if we were okay. They gathered all the kids in the library to await our parents. I remember the roof being caved in. There was glass everywhere and several inches of water on the floor. I remember that every window was blown out except one. I remember the devastation in the room and that our notebooks and everything was ruined. It was not until much later that I was scared. That night, when we watched the news coverage and I saw the destruction and realized how lucky we were, then I felt scared. Hankerson is the street on the north side of Bell. Leon Fergus at 1418 said he did not see the tornado. When his kids told him there were boards flying through the air, he said, "I never did see the boards. I just grabbed me a kid under each arm and all of us got under the dining room table." He had some roof damage, all of the windows were knocked out, and his car was badly damaged. Walton Wilkinson at 1422 Hankerson had the front of his house wrecked, the carport wall knocked down, and considerable damage throughout the house. Felix Mullings at 1506 had his roof collapsed and the living room ceiling badly damaged. P.J. Blackwell at 1516 Hankerson had some roof damage, mostly shingles loose, but part of Bell School was blown into his backyard, and pieces of board were interwoven into our chain-link fence. The street that connects 5th to the front of Bell School is Mahon, and it's 1 block long. Mrs. Earl W. Gargus was taking her son and 2 other children to school at Bell and was on Mahon between TJC and Bell when the tornado hit Bell. The rain was pouring down, and all at once the wind got so strong it shook my car. I could see the solid black mass ahead of us, so I stopped the car. I knew it was bad, so I tried to act as calm as I could to avoid frightening the children. The next thing I knew, shingles and timbers were flying through the air. Some of the shingles struck my car. When it was over, just a couple of minutes, I couldn't get to the Henderson Highway on Mahon because power lines were down across the street and debris was everywhere. Several houses on 5th facing TJC were damaged, including the house at 1415, which had its roof ripped off and a brick wall alongside the house demolished. Mrs. R.D. Ritchie at 1501 had her roof torn off and the north end of the house completely demolished, and L.H. Stringer at 1503 East 5th lost his roof and the garage was demolished. I think these houses are from that neighborhood. That's definitely on 5th Street. And I'm not sure where this boat was, but it's still part of the same tornado damage. Next in line was Tyler Junior College. The new Wise Auditorium had a section of its roof ripped off. Nearly all of the windows were broken, and heavy rains poured in on new furnishings, inflicting $50,000 worth of damages. The administration building was also injured, but nobody was hurt. The tornado took another skip and landed in the Palmer, Porter, Arnold, Houston Street area. A vacant house on Arnold received the brunt when it landed. Then it continued on into the home of Reverend J.E. Abla. He wasn't at home, but he rushed back when he saw the cloud. Water was over Porter Street, and trees and debris littered the area. The roof on my house was badly demolished. We had an iron clothesline pole in our backyard set in cement, which it snapped. Mrs. Ellis Ferguson at 623 South Porter was sitting in her car with her 3 children when the twister roared through. It picked the car up and then set it down. We escaped injury, but the house didn't. I was scared, but there was nothing I could do. I'll probably remember this as long as I live. The storm broke out their picture window and caved in a section of wall. Bill Ferguson emailed me that about a minute before the tornado hit, his dog, Tinker, was howling like a coyote, and she never did that before. Tinker and a dog belonging 2 houses down disappeared for 2 or 3 days. We saw huge oak trees, roots and all, fly by within 10 feet of our car. The roar after the dead silence was like a jet engine. My father was in the bathroom shaving and suddenly noticed the shaving cream pulling away from his face. He ran to the window and was shouting for us to stay in the car. We could not hear him for the roar. Our home suffered severe damage, but was still livable. Across the street, Friendly Baptist Church on the corner of Houston, Porter, and Friedel Streets had been discussing replacing their old large wooden structure, but the tornado left them with no choice. The Tyler paper reported the building practically useless. A student at Moore remembered seeing the steeple blown off. The church met in Bonner School until the new church building was finished. The tornado traveled down a side street almost due east, then turned into a northeasterly direction again toward the Kilgore Highway. Near the intersection of South Porter and Front, it knocked down trees, a partially constructed garage, and some small outhouses. It dipped down into the Black Fork Creek bottom at East Front, striking a home of C.O. McCoy at 2024 East Front. It blocked Black Fork Bridge on Front Street with uprooted trees. Mrs. McCoy reported, "I was trying to close the door when that big tree beside the house went down, and I saw the roof fly off the house. Hear anything? I was so excited, and it happened so suddenly, I don't know. It was all over in just a minute. When the roof flew off, I ran across the porch to the west side and went in the kitchen to lean against the wall. The window burst out and sprayed me with glass, but I didn't even get a scratch. Then, because of the wires, I'm so afraid of them, I ran into the yard. The roof from the east half of the house set about 50 yards out back. About 600 yards further northeast, 2 metal garages were heavily damaged. Then the tornado seemed to lift again until it reached the old Kilgore Highway. There it hit the Tyler Livestock Commission Company barn and pens, Rose City Livestock Auction barn and pens, Tyler Packing Company, and the H.E. White warehouse. 2 workers were in the Tyler Livestock Commission building when the funnel carried off portions of the livestock pens and about 1/4 of the south end of the tin-roofed building. Sections of the pens were lying across the highway in the drive to the Rose City auction barn. The Rose City livestock auction was extensively damaged, with nearly two-thirds of the building being unroofed, and adjoining feed pens, sheds, and pens knocked down and unroofed. Will Malone was in the Rose City auction barn when the tornado struck, but was uninjured. I was reading a hog journal, and I knew it was raining like fury, but I didn't think anything until I saw a sheet of tin flying by the window. Then I went to the door, but I couldn't get out because the air was thick with tin, so I just stayed where I was. It sounded like an airplane flying right down on the ground. It was over in just a minute and real still except for the rain. Malone said only one horse was injured by flying debris, and its injury was very minor. Tin from the roof of the auction barn and other structures were draped like wet sacks across fence posts. 2-inch timbers stuck in the ground behind the barn like leaning corn stalks and were driven up to 24 inches into the earth. The Tyler Packing Company only had its sign blown down on the front of the building. Nearly one-third of the huge H.E. White construction material warehouse was demolished. White was in the building when the storm struck and was injured by flying debris, but not seriously. Most of the roofing on the north side of the building was stripped off, and about one-third collapsed completely, stripped of metal siding. Debris from the White building was strewn over an open field for nearly a quarter of a mile to the Texas Power and Light substation on the old Longview Road. Mrs. J.E. Niblick, who lived at the intersection of Old Longview Road and FM 1803, which would become Loop 323, was the most seriously injured of anyone that day. She was hospitalized with a brain concussion after being hurled 15 feet from her porch and knocked unconscious. Debris from the auction barn and the White warehouse were found as far out as the Central Manufacturing Company plant, the old hide and rendering plant on what is now Loop 323, although that building itself was apparently not damaged. The tornado continued northward for at least 2 miles beyond the old Longview Road. For a while it followed Farm to Market, 1803, the Loop. About a quarter of a mile south of the Warren Petroleum Company facilities, it curved eastward. On Galleon Drive, northeast of Tyler, the funnel went west of a strip of houses in the Needham addition, completely demolishing a barn in the back of the G.C. Stiegel residence. It also removed part of a roof and blew out a window at the Stiegel home. The Harpy Bass house was moved a few inches off its foundation. Antennas on most of the Galleon Drive homes on one side of the street were damaged. The funnel then crossed Morningside Drive. It went through a 25-foot space between the homes of L.T. Davis and his son, John Davis, lifting a garage off its foundation and hurling it against a nearby barn. Wreckage from the garage and barn were strewn hundreds of feet northeast of the Davis residences. A half-mile further, a barn belonging to A.N. Beasley was damaged. Much of its sheet metal roof curled upward. A tree beside the barn was lifted out of the ground. This was the northernmost point of property damage reported in Smith County. Meanwhile, back in town, there were 5 surgeries in progress at Medical Center Hospital when the electricity went out. George Pearson said, "We can get our electricity via 3 different routes. The tornado knocked out all 3. They had to resort to an emergency gasoline generator." Radio station KTBB stayed on the air after the tornado hit until about 9:30 a.m. when the power went off. It didn't come back up again until 11:30. During that time, it taped on-the-spot descriptions of tornado damage and eyewitness interviews to be rebroadcast, but unfortunately, that tape has not survived. Neither has any television footage. News of the tornado spread rapidly to the Tyler Police, the Civil Defense Team, the Red Cross, and the Salvation Army. The Red Cross set up 2 disaster headquarters, one in the Green Acres area and one in front of Bell School. This is the one in front of Bell School. The Gray Ladies of the Red Cross began serving donuts, coffee, and sandwiches to both victims and to relief workers. They were on duty all night up to 2 a.m. Saturday, and the Bell site stayed open until Sunday. Restaurants and cafes supplied free food. Captain and Mrs. L.C. Barrington, Salvation Army, plus workers from Longview, arrived in the disaster area early Friday. As of Friday evening, neither the Red Cross nor the Salvation Army received any requests for shelter. Neighbors took in neighbors and helped feed them. The Red Cross also conveyed scores of telegrams between Tylerites and their relatives throughout the country. Rumors spread that the Red Cross and/or the Salvation Army took money for food and coffee, but that was denounced in the paper by Ernie Liebig, head of Civil Defense. All available streets, garbage, parks, and water department crews were dispatched to the scene to help with cleanup, and the Tyler Home Builders Association announced a free emergency service for people needing temporary repairs. Homes needing relatively minor repairs were mended adequately before heavy rains hit again on Friday afternoon and night. The Tyler Police Department, Highway Patrol, Boy Scouts, and Explorer Scouts patrolled the blocked-off disaster areas. These barricades came down about 4 p.m. on Sunday. TPNL had isolated damaged areas within 35 minutes of the tornado strike and sent out 7 crews within a few minutes after the disaster report was received. Telephones were restored by Saturday evening, except to demolished houses. The television cable took a little longer. By Saturday, which was dry and almost sunny, the streets were free of litter. By the end of the day, much of the wreckage had been cleared up, and those houses with minor damage had been repaired. The Civil Defense Co-Coordinator, Ernie Liebig, paid tribute to Tylerites Sunday for their cooperation in the 3 days following the tornado. I don't have anything but praise for the many individuals and groups who have aided in our work, as well as for the spirit shown by those who were victims of the tornado. There wasn't any person whom we called on for help who didn't do more than we asked for. There are so many businesses, individuals, and organizations that aided in our work that it is impossible not to overlook some in compiling a list of those who helped. Our eternal gratitude goes to all of them. The Tyler Ministerial Alliance sponsored a community-wide service of thanksgiving for Tylerites having been spared any loss of life or serious injury, Sunday at 3 p.m. at Wise Auditorium. Galloway Calhoun presided at the service with music led by Lauren Sprunger of Green Acres Baptist Church. Ministers from First Presbyterian, Pollard Methodist, Friendly Baptist, Marvin Methodist, and Highland Presbyterian also participated, as well as Dr. Hollis A. Moore, Superintendent of Schools. Some 300 or more people attended. By then, the roof had been patched and all glass was restored, although the ceiling was discolored where water had leaked through. All of the mess of rain and glass had been cleaned up, and the battered draperies and seats renovated. Maintenance crews and male students had pitched in right away on Friday morning. While there were no classes at TJC on Friday, the day of the tornado, students were back at school there on Monday. Andy Woods and Bell Elementary canceled classes on both Friday and Monday, but all Andy Woods students resumed on campus on Tuesday. At Bell, all but the 6th grade classes resumed there on Tuesday. The 6th grade reported to Moore Junior High until their rooms could be repaired. Bell 1st graders used the Bell Library. Smith County was designated a disaster county, both from the tornado and from flooding, making residents eligible for loans at 3% through the Small Business Administration. H.M. Lowe of the General Adjustment Bureau placed preliminary estimates of damages at $1 million plus. 2 elementary schools at about $100,000 each, 75 houses at $3,000 to $5,000 each, 125 houses at $750 to $1,000 each, and 200 on the fringe of the tornado's path at $300 to $500 each. The Tyler paper, 15 years later, in 1972, said, "The tornado's entire path through Tyler took no more than 2 or 3 minutes. Witnesses reported when it was gone, leaving only a trail of debris and memories that have not faded in 15 years. Perhaps they never will. Now, at the 50-year mark, I can say with some assurance that the memories will remain vivid for as long as any of us who survived it are alive."